It is early morning in the Pamir Mountains, and a shepherd is already 3 hours into a climb that most tourists would call a full day's expedition. Behind him, peaks over 7,000 meters catch the first light while the valley below is still dark. There is no road up here, no cell signal, and the nearest hospital is a full day's drive away on switchbacks carved into the side of a cliff. This is not a remote corner of Tajikistan. For a huge share of the country, this is simply Tuesday. Now hold on to that image. We will get there. Language and identity here trace back further than most people assume. Tajik uses a modified Cyrillic alphabet today, a Soviet-era legacy, even though the language itself is essentially a dialect of Persian, nearly identical in grammar and vocabulary to the Farsi spoken in Iran and the Dari spoken across the border in Afghanistan, a linguistic link so close that Tajiks and Iranians can generally understand each other's spoken language with only modest effort. Despite living in countries thousands of kilometers apart with very different modern political systems, start with the geography, because almost nothing about daily life here makes sense without it. Tajikistan is landlocked, mountainous, and small by Central Asian standards, wedged between Afghanistan to the south, Uzbekistan to the west, Kyrgyzstan to the north, and China to the east. Roughly 93% of the entire country sits on mountainous terrain, and more than half of that is above 3,000 meters. The Pamir Range alone contains some of the highest peaks outside the Himalayas, tall enough that Soviet mountaineers once used them as training ground for actual Everest expeditions. Around 11 million people live here, a population that has more than doubled since independence in 1991 and skews remarkably young. The median age sits at just over 22, one of the youngest populations anywhere outside sub-Saharan Africa. Only about a quarter of the population lives in cities, which means the overwhelming majority of Tajiks live in villages scattered through valleys that, in winter, can be cut off from the rest of the country for weeks at a time when mountain passes close under snow. Here is the unexpected fact that explains a huge amount about how this country actually survives. Tajikistan runs on remittance money sent home by its own citizens working abroad. Millions of Tajik men travel to Russia every year for construction and manual labor, and the money they wire back accounts for one of the highest remittance to GDP ratios anywhere on the planet. In some years, cash sent home by migrant workers has made up close to half the entire national economy. Entire villages here are functionally run by women, grandparents, and children for most of the year, while husbands and fathers work thousands of kilometers away in Moscow or Yekaterinburg, sending money home in increments that keep households fed, kids in school, and weddings paid for. Now, the part almost no visitor expects. The country most associated today with mountain trekking and Pamir highway road trips spent the 1990s in one of the deadliest civil wars to follow the Soviet collapse, and it shaped almost everything about how modern Tajikistan is governed. Before any of that, though, this stretch of Central Asia carried enormous historical weight of its own. The ancient city of Panjshir, now mostly ruins near the Uzbek border, was once a thriving Sogdian trading center on the Silk Road, its merchants moving goods, ideas, and religions between China, Persia, and the Mediterranean world centuries before Islam arrived in the region. Tajiks today often point to this Sogdian and later Samanid Persian heritage as the cultural bedrock of their national identity, a claim to civilizational depth that stands in deliberate contrast to the country's current standing as one of the poorest nations in Asia. Ground-level daily life runs on a rhythm shaped by both Persian heritage and mountain isolation. Tajik is a Persian language, closely related to the Farsi spoken in Iran and the Dari spoken in Afghanistan, which makes Tajikistan linguistically and culturally distinct from every one of its Turkic-speaking Central Asian neighbors, a difference that traces back over 1,000 years to the Persian Samanid Empire, which many Tajiks still consider the cultural high point of their national history. Hospitality carries enormous weight here, arguably even more than in neighboring countries. A guest, invited or not, is treated as an honored arrival. Tables are set with more food than anyone could reasonably finish, tea is poured continuously, and refusing what's offered can genuinely offend a host. Ash, a rice dish cooked with carrots, meat, and oil, usually in a massive shared pot called a kazan, functions as the national dish, served at everything from casual family dinners to weddings feeding hundreds of guests. Bread carries near-sacred status. Round, flat naan bread is never placed upside down, never thrown away, and never stepped on, reflecting a symbolic respect for food that runs through daily etiquette everywhere in the country. Winters in the mountains are genuinely brutal, with entire high-altitude villages effectively snowed in for months, dependent on stockpiled food and, increasingly, solar power, where the electrical grid doesn't reliably reach. Summers in the lower Fergana Valley region, by contrast, run hot and dry, ideal for the cotton and fruit orchards that remain a major part of the rural economy. Transport across the country is dictated entirely by geography. The Pamir Highway, one of the highest and most dramatic roads on Earth, is the only real route connecting the capital to the remote Gorno-Badakhshan region, a journey that can take 2 full days to cover a few hundred kilometers. Yes, this is the part the title promised. The real women, weddings, and traditions behind the headline, and it goes far deeper than the aesthetic. Tajik weddings are genuinely massive cultural events, sometimes stretching across multiple days and involving hundreds of guests, elaborate embroidered dresses, and ceremonial customs passed down through generations. A bride's traditional outfit alone, hand-embroidered in regional patterns specific to her family's home valley, can take months to complete and represent a serious financial investment for the family hosting the celebration. The government has actually tried, at various points, to legally limit how extravagant these celebrations can get, capping guest numbers and banning certain lavish practices, specifically because families were going into debt trying to host weddings elaborate enough to meet social expectations. That's the pivot we're sitting with. The beauty and spectacle of these celebrations sits directly on top of real economic pressure. Many families spend years saving for a single wedding, sometimes drawing on remittance money sent home specifically for that purpose, because the social cost of hosting a modest celebration can weigh as heavily as the financial cost of an expensive one. Behind the embroidered dresses and celebratory feasts is a very real culture of financial sacrifice, one where a family's social standing is measured in part by how generously they can host their community for a single event. Suzani embroidery, the intricate needlework covering many of these ceremonial garments and wall hangings, is itself a distinct regional art form passed down almost entirely from mother to daughter, with patterns and color combinations specific enough that specialists can often identify which valley a particular piece came from just by studying the stitching. Women's roles here carry their own complexity too. In rural areas, traditional expectations around marriage age, family obligation, and household responsibility remain strong. And with so many working-age men abroad for labor migration, women frequently run entire households, farms, and small businesses independently for months or years at a stretch, a form of practical authority that doesn't always translate into formal legal or economic power, since Tajikistan's laws and land ownership customs still often favor male relatives. In Dushanbe and other urban centers, meanwhile, growing numbers of young women are pursuing university education and professional careers, part of a slow but real generational shift away from the more rigid, rural norms their mothers grew up with. Here is a fact that says more about the whole country than any single statistic could. Tajikistan is the only Central Asian republic that fought a full civil war after Soviet independence, and the government that emerged from that war has run the country largely unchallenged ever since. That war ran from 1992 to 1997, pitting the post-Soviet government against a coalition of regional, Islamist, and democratic opposition groups in a conflict that killed tens of thousands of people and displaced hundreds of thousands more, some of whom never returned to their home villages at all. The war ended in a negotiated peace deal, brokered partly by the United Nations, that folded opposition figures into a unity government, a peace that has technically held for nearly 3 decades, even as political power has steadily consolidated around a single leader and his family since then. Independent media and political opposition remain tightly restricted, and international observers have repeatedly flagged concerns about human rights and press freedom. Layer under that, the Pamir region, Gorno-Badakhshan, is religiously and culturally distinct from the rest of the country, home to a majority Ismaili Muslim population that follows the spiritual leadership of the Aga Khan rather than the Sunni Hanafi tradition dominant elsewhere in Tajikistan. That religious difference, combined with the region's remoteness and history of political friction with Dushanbe, has occasionally boiled over into unrest, including deadly clashes between Pamiri protesters and government security forces in recent years. A tension most outside observers never hear about because the region is simply too remote to attract sustained international media attention. The Aga Khan Development Network has, in turn, invested heavily in Gorno-Badakhshan specifically because of that Ismaili connection, funding schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects across a region the central government in Dushanbe has historically underfunded, meaning some of the best healthcare and education access in the entire country exists precisely in its most remote, mountainous corner. A genuinely unusual pattern compared to how development typically flows in poor nations. That's the resilience running underneath every Nowruz bonfire and every wedding song here. A country that fought a civil war within living memory, absorbed hundreds of thousands of displaced families, and still built a functioning, if imperfect, peace on top of it. Nowruz itself, the Persian New Year celebrated at the spring equinox, is by far the most important holiday on the national calendar, predating Islam in the region by well over 1,000 years. Celebrations stretch across days, with communal meals, traditional games, and the ceremonial Hafsin table, 7 symbolic items whose names begin with the same Persian letter, each representing a wish for the year ahead, a tradition shared with Iran and Afghanistan that ties Tajikistan's cultural identity to the wider Persian-speaking world far more than to its immediate Central Asian neighbors. Here is where the armchair daydream becomes a spreadsheet. GDP per capita sits at under $2,000 nominal, the lowest in Central Asia by a wide margin and among the lowest in all of Asia. Roughly a quarter of the population lives below the national poverty line, and the country remains heavily dependent on foreign aid, international loans, and the remittance income already mentioned. For a visitor, that translates into extraordinarily low costs. A full meal of ash and tea in Dushanbe can cost a couple of dollars, and guest house stays in the Pamirs, run by local families, often cost less than a fast food meal back home. But that cheapness is a distance measured in someone else's hours, and in this case, someone else's distance from their own family for months or years at a time. Average monthly wages inside the country remain extremely low, which is precisely why so many working-age men leave for Russia in the first place. The wage gap between labor in Tajikistan and labor abroad is simply too large for many families to ignore, even accounting for the personal cost of prolonged separation. If you have made it this far and you are enjoying the journey, a like and a subscribe genuinely help. It's free, and it tells us to keep making documentaries like this one. Now, this is the secret the title promised. Beyond the civil war and the political consolidation that followed it, Tajikistan shares a long, porous border with Afghanistan, and instability on the other side of that border has repeatedly spilled over in the form of smuggling, militant activity, and refugee movement. The government has used that instability, in part, to justify tight restrictions on religious practice inside the country. Mosque attendance for anyone under 18 has at various points been legally restricted, and beards and certain forms of religious dress have faced government scrutiny, part of a broader state effort to prevent the kind of religious extremism that fueled instability elsewhere in the region. There's a quieter secret, too. The sheer scale of male labor migration has reshaped family structure across the entire country. Divorce rates connected to prolonged migration have risen, and cases of men starting second, unofficial families while working abroad have become common enough to be a recognized social issue, leaving first wives and children back home in a legally and financially precarious position with limited institutional support. Petty theft and scams targeting tourists remain relatively rare here compared to more heavily touristed countries, largely because tourism itself is still a small industry. But road conditions in the mountains are a genuine, serious hazard, with poorly maintained routes, landslides, and limited emergency services making travel in remote regions riskier than it might first appear. Travelers heading into Gorno-Badakhshan or near the Afghan border are generally advised to arrange permits and travel with experienced local guides rather than attempting independent routes. But look closer at the landscape, and the darker chapters give way to something genuinely staggering. The Pamir Range holds glaciers larger than entire small countries, including the Fedchenko Glacier, one of the longest glaciers on Earth outside the polar regions, feeding river systems that much of Central Asia depends on for water. Iskandar, a glacial lake named after Alexander the Great, sits at nearly 3,000 meters. Its water an almost unnatural turquoise from mineral runoff, ringed by peaks that turn pink at sunset. The Wakhan Corridor, a narrow strip of territory separating Tajikistan from Pakistan by way of a thin sliver of Afghanistan, is one of the most remote inhabited regions on the planet, home to isolated communities that have maintained distinct languages and customs for centuries, largely because almost nothing about the terrain makes contact with the outside world easy. And the Rogan Dam, still under construction on the Vakhsh River, is set to become the tallest dam on Earth once finished. An enormous hydropower project the government has staked much of the country's future economic hopes on, aiming to turn Tajikistan's mountain water into an exportable source of electricity for the entire region. That hydropower ambition carries real regional tension of its own. Downstream neighbor Uzbekistan spent years publicly opposing the Rogan project, worried it would restrict the river water Uzbek cotton farms depend on, a dispute that occasionally strained diplomatic relations between the two countries for the better part of a decade before a more cooperative approach eventually took hold. It's a reminder that Tajikistan's mountains aren't just scenery, they're the literal water tower for a large chunk of arid Central Asia, and controlling that water carries genuine geopolitical weight far beyond Tajikistan's own small economy. If this country is going to pull you in, here is where to put your feet first. Dushanbe, the capital, is a green, low-rise city built largely during the Soviet era, home to some of the tallest flagpoles on Earth and a national museum housing a 48-meter reclining Buddha statue, a relic from Tajikistan's pre-Islamic Buddhist past that most visitors never expect to find in a majority Muslim Central Asian capital. From there, the Fan Mountains offer some of the most accessible high-altitude trekking in the region, with turquoise lakes and traditional villages a manageable few hours from Dushanbe. For something further off the standard route, the full Pamir Highway journey toward Karag and onward to Murghab is widely considered one of the great overland road trips left on Earth, a multi-day route through some of the highest, starkest terrain anywhere, passing hot springs, ancient fortress ruins, and villages where the Wakhi and Pamiri languages, distinct from mainstream Tajik, are still spoken daily. Along that same route, the town of Karag itself sits in a valley so narrow that the local botanical garden, one of the highest altitude botanical gardens on Earth, had to be built on a steep hillside terrace simply because there was no flat ground available anywhere nearby. Further east, the high-altitude town of Murghab, close to the Chinese and Kyrgyz borders, is home to a largely ethnic Kyrgyz population living at over 3,600 meters, herding yaks across a landscape so barren and windswept that some travelers compare it more to the Tibetan Plateau than to anywhere else in Central Asia. So here is the mirror. Tajikistan spent the 20th century as a remote, mountainous edge of first the Russian and then the Soviet Empire, absorbed a brutal civil war in its first decade of independence, and has spent the decades since rebuilding an economy that depends, in large part, on its own citizens leaving home to survive. In just over 30 years, it has built a fragile peace on top of real trauma, kept centuries-old wedding and hospitality traditions alive, even as poverty and migration have reshaped nearly every family in the country, and turned some of the most extreme terrain on Earth into a genuine, if still tiny source of national pride and tourism revenue. Maybe the real question isn't whether Tajikistan is beautiful, or poor, or hard to reach. It's whether you've ever once lived with the kind of distance this country asks its own families to accept every single year, fathers and husbands gone for months at a time, weddings planned around money sent from thousands of kilometers away, just to keep a household in the mountains standing.